Give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition. Order. Members on my right.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes that the Prime Minister is dividing the nation with his divisive voice proposal by deliberately refusing to provide detail to the Australian people. 2 notes that the Prime Minister promised on 34 occasions to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which includes the Makarratta Commission's national treaty-making process, but has since continually denied that there will be a treaty. 3 notes that the Minister for Indigenous Australians said work on a treaty was to start within weeks, but the Prime Minister is now walking that back. In 2 train wreck media interviews, the Prime Minister is telling different audiences different things on the treaty. 4 notes that despite the Prime Minister being shifty on whether a treaty is being worked on, he's already allocated $5.8 million for the Makarratta Commission national treaty-making process, but refuses to explain how $900,000 of this money has already been spent. 5 notes that the government's Minister for Indigenous Australians has treated this House with absolute contempt by repeatedly and consistently failing to answer direct questions in question time, and 6 condemns the Prime Minister for his complete inability to be upfront and honest with the Australian people, and calls on the Prime Minister to explain today in plain language, A, what the voice will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, B, what the Makarratta Commission will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, C, what the money for the Makarratta Commission is being spent on, and D, what the treaty-making process will be, how long it will take and what the financial implications for the Commonwealth and for taxpayers will be.
Is leave granted?
Leave's not granted, but if you move to suspension, we're not going to shut you down.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion. That the House 1 notes that this Prime Minister is dividing the nation with his divisive voice proposal by deliberately refusing to provide detail to the Australian people. 2 notes that the Prime Minister promised on 34 occasions to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which includes the Makarratta Commission's national treaty-making process, but has since continually denied that there will be a treaty. 3 notes that the Minister for Indigenous Australians said work on a treaty was to start within weeks, but the Prime Minister is now walking that back. In 2 train wreck media interviews, the Prime Minister is telling different audiences different things on the treaty. 4 notes that despite the Prime Minister being shifty on whether a treaty is being worked on, he's already allocated $5.8 million for the Makarratta Commission national treaty-making process, but refuses to explain how $900,000 of the money has already been spent. 5 notes that the government's Minister for Indigenous Australians has treated this House with contempt by repeatedly and consistently failing to directly answer questions in question time, and 6 condemns the Prime Minister for his complete inability to be upfront and honest with the Australian people, and calls on the Prime Minister to explain today in plain language, A, what the voice will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, B, what the Makarratta Commission will be, how it will be structured and how it will operate, C, what the money for the Makarratta Commission is being spent on, and D, what the treaty-making process will be, how long it will take and what the financial implications for the Commonwealth and for taxpayers will be. Mr Speaker, the reality is that this Prime Minister stood up at Garma and said to the Australian people with great passion, with much emotion, that he proposed words that hadn't been consulted on, that hadn't been properly researched, ultimately that were against advice by the government, Mr Speaker, by the government solicitor who had advised against the breadth of words that now are being proposed by way of referendum to the Australian people. Now, Mr Speaker, every Australian wants a better outcome for Indigenous Australians. Every Australian wants to see a better outcome in Alice Springs. Mr Speaker, every Australian wants to see a better outcome for children in terms of school attendance, in terms of health outcomes, of life expectancy. We want to see better housing options. But, Mr Speaker, the Voice is not going to deliver that practical support on the ground because it is a Canberra voice and a voice for the elite of this country. Why, Mr Speaker, can you ask yourself this, why, on the current information available to us, why do we have a situation where 29% of Labor voters in this country are not supporting the Voice? Now, if the Prime Minister had any coherent explanation to the Australian public as to how the Voice will work, what outcomes it will deliver, the breadth, what the interpretation will be in the High Court, how it will change our system of government, then perhaps there would be some chance of convincing those 29% of Labor voters. But the Prime Minister is deliberately and willingly withholding that information from Labor voters and from the Australian public. And that is why, Mr Speaker, this situation goes from bad to worse, because the Australian Prime Minister is seeking to divide his nation. That's what's happening here, Mr Speaker. The best-case scenario on this incompetent Prime Minister's approach to the Voice is that you might get a 51-49 yes outcome, bearing in mind that you need a double majority.
Members on
that
my right.
splits our country straight down the middle. Straight down the middle. Now, no Prime Minister in good conscience would decide over such a process unless he was seeking political advantage or unless he was out of his depth. Now, Australian families at the moment are paying more for their electricity bills. They're paying more at the grocery checkout. They're paying more for their insurance. They're paying more for their mortgages because of this incompetent government. The incompetence is not just demonstrated in terms of the Prime Minister's management around the Voice. It is every aspect of government delivery at the moment. That's what the Australian public is experiencing. And, Mr Speaker, I'll tell you that when you walk the streets, when you talk to people across the country, that is why they are saying they are not better off today than when Labor was elected. The Australian public knows that this Prime Minister is taking us down a cul-de-sac. This Prime Minister is dividing the country unnecessarily because there is a bipartisan position in this country at the moment that would see a question on recognition in the Constitution for our first occupants of this country. It would receive 80% support across the nation. It can be put to the people in October of this year. It wouldn't divide, but it would unite the country. And yet our Prime Minister knowingly rejects that proposition. Why? I mean, why would he reject a proposition to unite our country? Why would he cast that aside and instead go down the path of pitching one Australian against the other? Why would it be, Mr Speaker, that 1 in 3 Labor voters has called this Prime Minister out as a fake and phony? We know this Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. We know more and more about him every day. His great idol, Kevin Rudd, we see more of Kevin Rudd in this Prime Minister as every day goes by. We knew of Kevin Rudd that he started out, but he was somebody very different than what the public believed him to be. This Prime Minister will say one thing to one audience and tell the next audience what they want to hear. But the problem is, Mr Speaker, that people match up what he's saying. So when you turn up to a midnight oil concert and you're wearing a T-shirt that says that you're in favour of yes and you're in favour of treaty and you're in favour of truth-telling, you know what that says? It doesn't say, as the Prime Minister wants us to believe, that he turned up not adequately attired for a midnight oil concert and that somehow, in a snap moment of choice, he finds himself clothed in a midnight oil T-shirt. It's sort of like a Deirdre Chambers moment. It does have a ring of that to it. I mean, how did this T-shirt find itself on my body? That's what he's arguing, and it shows you how insincere this man is. Prime Minister, you have the opportunity to unite the Australian people.
Order.
You have the opportunity to cut through the waste that is taking place in the money that's administered to help Indigenous Australians. You have the opportunity to work with us to make sure that we listen to Indigenous Australians and get the outcomes that they deserve. But you are not going to do it through a treaty process that you have embarrassingly walked away from. And talked in a duplicitous way to the Australian public on this topic. A Makarratta Commission that's been funded but is operating in secrecy, that you will not speak anything about. The Prime Minister has the opportunity to step up and to unite the Australian public. He is not doing that. And when a Prime Minister makes a deliberate decision to harm our national interest, I'll tell you who is watching: the entire Australian public, because they are disappointed in this Prime Minister. He has the chance to do good and he's choosing not to do so. And when he goes up to Garma, he can be sincere, Mr Speaker. He can be sincere this time, because at the last Garma conference he provided the detail of the words, but no detail every day since that point. And that's the problem here. The problem is not with the Australian public, as those opposite want us to believe. The Australian public's not hard-hearted. People aren't saying that they're voting no because they don't want to support Indigenous Australians. They will vote no because they know this Prime Minister is wilfully withholding detail from them. And that is unconscionable. And it's something the Prime Minister should apologise for. It's something that he should be upfront with the Australian public so that they can be properly informed when they cast their vote. But every day, and bearing in mind we're less than 3 months from this referendum vote, the Prime Minister makes a decision not to look Australians in the eye and answer the questions that they appropriately are putting to him. And when an Australian Prime Minister breaks that trust with the Australian people that voted for him only 15 months ago, they've worked out that this bloke is a phony and a fraud and is running an incompetent government.
Is the motion seconded?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the
I
Leader of
second
the
the
Nationals.
motion. Thank you.